Good afternoon. My name is John Kellewert. I'm the Integrated Assessment Program Director at the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan. You've joined us for our Hydraulic Fracturing in Michigan webinar on the technical reports that we've recently released and our plans for moving forward with an integrated assessment on this topic. We're going to start just in a few seconds, but just wanted to get things rolling.
Hi, this is Maggie Allen with the Graham Sustainability Institute. Before we get going, I want to do a quick sound check. So if you can hear me loud and clear, I would appreciate if you could raise your hand. You do that by selecting the hand icon on the left-hand side of the GoToWebinar interface. Great, I'm seeing a bunch of hands, so it sounds like our sound's working just fine. Before I turn things back to John, I just want to let you know that you can start submitting your questions or comments at any time using the question box in the interface. I'll be compiling those questions and we'll be answering those verbally later on in the webinar. And then lastly, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Graham Institute webpage where the technical reports are available for download. And so now I'll turn things back to John.
Thanks, Maggie. So our plan for today is we've got a little bit of a half hour or so, and what we'd like to do is provide a brief overview of what we're doing with this project, who's involved, how things are unfolding. Then we'd really like to spend the majority of the time taking questions from you that will be answered by project staff and researchers, several of the researchers who have been involved with this project for a little bit over a year now. And we'll end things roughly around 12:30, and we may go over a minute or two just to make sure we get through the question that we're dealing with at that time. So the folks that are involved in the webinar today, myself, John Kellewert, and then we have three of the technical report authors. Sarah Gossman, who's a lecturer at the U of M Law School and was the faculty lead for the technical report on policy and law. Newt Nadelhofer, a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology, and also the director of the University of Michigan Biological Station. And Newt was one of the co-authors for the report on environment and ecology. And the third author of the technical report who's with us here today is Kim Wolski, who's an Herb Institute Research Management Fellow and co-author of the technical report on public perceptions. And Maggie will be working with us throughout the time, kind of fielding questions and dealing with any technical issues that come up. As I get started, I want to acknowledge and thank the members of the steering committee we've put together for this integrated assessment. I won't go through this entire list, but we're fortunate to have folks from the University of Michigan, several units, particularly the Herb Institute, the Risk Science Center, and the University of Michigan Energy Institute. We also have several folks from the state, the Governor's Office, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Quality, industry representatives, and representatives from several environmental groups. And I also just wanted to put up the name of all the folks who've been involved in preparing the technical reports, all 7 of them. Thank them for their time and their contributions to bringing us where we are now with having these reports available. So in terms of what we're doing, we're calling this an integrated assessment. And at the Graham Sustainability Institute, we use integrated assessment as an approach to bring together academics, decision makers, and stakeholders on a variety of topics. This assessment on hydraulic fracturing is one of about a half dozen assessments that we currently have underway that scale anywhere from focusing on sustainability issues here on campus to 2 projects in other countries. We have things in the Detroit area, things throughout the Great Lake region. Basically how we approach these topics through integrated assessment is to spend a substantial amount of time first trying to define the issue, understanding some of the background, then moving into identify and evaluating some potential solutions, and perhaps developing tools and information to help guide decisions. All of this should come as a result in an analysis of policy options. And so, a big part is, with these integrated assessments is that not only might there be disagreement about what the solutions could be, but there's often disagreement when we get started about just defining the issue or understanding what the topic is. As we move through these, the assessments are informed by, in this one, the technical reports that involve pulling data together, doing some analyses, and then move into the next phase, which will be more about evaluating options and perhaps developing new resources. Simultaneously, we are seeking input from a variety of stakeholders, folks directly involved in this topic, either through a regulatory perspective or professional in their work, and folks that are deeply concerned about the topic. We've had opportunities since we started this last year for anyone to provide comments and ideas for the project, and we will continue that approach throughout the rest of the project. So what can we say about hydraulic fracturing in Michigan? So this is just some general information about the topic, not necessarily drawing from the technical reports yet. But it has been used in Michigan for decades in thousands of wells. Hydraulic fracturing as an approach, as a technology, is not new to Michigan. It has been used for several decades. There was a 2003 review of state oil and natural gas regulations done by a group called Stronger. Resulted in finding that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality has a well-managed oil and gas environmental regulatory program. That report, though, did not specifically address the topic of hydraulic fracturing. The work that we're doing through the assessment here at the University of Michigan generally focuses on high volume activity, what the state defines as anything using more than 100,000 gallons of fracturing fluid. But if you've had a chance to read through the reports, you'll see that sometimes the reports address oil and gas in general or hydraulic fracturing in general, but one of our key interests is looking specifically at high volume activity. Currently, there's very limited high volume activity at present, so looking at the two maps on your screen now, the top one represents all oil and gas in Michigan, and the bottom is just the high volume permit or current activity or completed sites. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that there are a broad range of perspectives on both the benefits and the problems of expanded natural gas use. What we're trying to do through this assessment, we've been following a very general question, trying to think about what are the best environmental, economic, social, and technological approaches for looking at and managing hydraulic fracturing in the state of Michigan. Very broad, very open. We've just completed the technical reports, which covered these 7 areas, as we talked about before, with the objective to provide a foundation of information for decision makers and stakeholders that will also inform later policy analysis. And then the integrated assessment will focus specifically on an analysis of strategic policy options regarding hydraulic fracturing in Michigan. In some ways, it'll be similar to what we've done so far, but some key differences that'll focus on those options. We'll continue with regular engagement with decision makers and stakeholders, and hopefully work through collaboration and coordination amongst the faculty that are going to be involved to identify some common themes and strategies on this topic for Michigan into the future. What we will not be doing is providing specific policy recommendations for the state, but coming up with an analysis of options that we believe will be helpful for a broad range of decision makers, folks definitely within at the state, but also environmental groups, industry groups, stakeholders, local municipalities, etc. Now, I just want to offer a brief point on each of the 7 technical reports which have been released, and hopefully you've already found them on our website. If not, we'll provide information later in the presentation about where to access them, but hopefully you've seen them already. There are 7. We've kind of presented them in a particular order, starting with technology, which provided a very broad overview of oil and gas and then focused in on Michigan. One of the key things that came out of that report is kind of looking at the level of activity right now and suggesting perhaps that there's a limited amount of activity due to low natural gas prices. They have been higher in the past, but right now they're low, and one point that's come up is perhaps this is limiting some of the activity, a reason for the limited activity we're currently seeing in Michigan at present. The geology report noted that there's been a lot of interest in this topic, but we, again, are only seeing a handful of such wells the high volume wells that go down much deeper and use, as I said, according to the state threshold, something more than 100,000 gallons of hydraulic fracturing fluid. The Environment and Ecology Report points out potential impacts, and I think here it's important to mention that throughout the reports, what we are offering is a hazard identification, not a scientific risk assessment. I think it's important to make that distinction, and we'll talk a little bit more about that through our time today. Public health has a similar approach of identifying possible hazards, a broad range of communities, individuals. If you've looked at it, it's very comprehensive in terms of the number of topics that have been discussed, and thinking about that in light of expanded hydraulic fracturing within the state. The Policy and Law Report does a thorough review of what is involved in terms of state regulations regarding this topic, and it points out some key issues such as the chemical additives are disclosed or released as 60 days after well completion, and that Michigan takes some slightly different approaches than some other states in terms of using a reporting website called Frac Focus. The economics report has, again, looks at oil and gas in general, but attempts to make some indications in terms of future activity based on activity thus far, and said probably that we'll see some increase, but it will not be enough to make or break the state's economy. And the Public Perceptions Report provides an interesting overview of survey results from a variety of different sources, and notes that for a slight majority of Michigan residents believe that fracking outweighs the risk, but there are still concerns about potential impacts from the process. So what I'd like to do at this point is turn to our three faculty that we have with us, the co-authors of the reports, to just offer, we won't be going through all 7 reports, but for the 3 individuals who are with us, to provide a comment or two about what they see as some of the key insights or findings from their reports that they'd like to emphasize. So could I turn to Sarah? Would you like to mention something about the Law and Policy Report?
Great, thanks, John. So a couple things about my report. I think the first one is that I deliberately took a life cycle approach to thinking about policy and laws. That is, I didn't look just at the laws governing high volume hydraulic fracturing chemical use, so those are obviously very important, but I looked at everything from mineral ownership and leasing through to waste management, because the scale of high volume hydraulic fracturing affects the way those laws are implemented, even if they don't directly address high volume hydraulic fracturing. A couple other things that I want to point out about the report. In looking through those laws overall, I conclude that the level of government most involved in law and policy is the state level. So state governments are the ones making most of the law and policy, and that oil and gas environmental agencies, not necessarily legislatures, are making most of the policy. And then finally, on the policy approach, most of what I saw in looking at the trends, and specifically in Michigan, is a focus on the traditional types of policy approaches that are used in environmental law and oil and gas law. These are, for the most part, prescriptive requirements and performance-based requirements, things like the strength of the casing in the well. But there is one exception to that, and that is chemical disclosure as a policy approach. Here, using information to provide the public with some knowledge about what chemicals are being injected into wells. And then the last thing I guess I would want to note about my report is that I do look at 5 areas of state policymaking in further detail, and these are public participation, land use, water withdrawals, chemical disclosure, again, and special protections for landowners. And I consider a range of possible policies. Now, this does not include every single state, but it's intended to give a sense of the range, again, of the possible policy approaches and also to give a sense of where Michigan falls within that range. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Newt, could you offer a comment or two about the ecology report?
Sure, I could. So one of the things that's important for us to do is to step back and really look at where Michigan is in the world and how what similarities it shares with other areas that are being fracked, and where we might differ. And one unique aspect of Michigan is that we are in the middle, the exact middle actually, of the world's largest surface freshwater system, which is the Great Lakes system. We're the epicenter of that basin, is at the northern tip of lower Michigan, which is where a lot of the fracking activity is anticipated. So it's really important to consider protection of those water resources, both as an example for other water-rich regions and for our own self-interest. These water resources are important for all kinds of reasons, biologically, environmentally, culturally, and economically. Any risks that are realized in our region actually have effects on our economy, on our culture, and on the biological resources that we live in the middle of. And it's further important to realize that every square inch of the landscape in Michigan is connected to other square inches by networks of rivers that connect lakes, wetlands, and ultimately our coastal zones in lakes Michigan, Huron, and Superior. These are also connected to shallow groundwater from which we get much of our drinking water. So the take-home message from our report, which identifies potential hazards, but as John said, does not do a risk assessment, we are essentially enumerating and identifying the potential hazards that we have to plan for, that we have to minimize coming into any, we basically have to minimize the risk of those hazards becoming real. So we've outlined a number of things. I think one of the most important recommendations is that we really need to do site-specific risk assessment of major drilling areas. General guidelines are fine as a first cut, but knowing the local freshwater resources in a potential drilling site, how they're connected to upland systems, and how they're connected to groundwater, what are the flow paths in this region before we decide that a half a mile from a stream headwater is far enough. We really need to have some sense of what the groundwater flow paths are. We need to plan how infrastructure is designed and implemented. In other words, are there smart ways that we can build fewer roads and fewer pads so that potential erosion and export of flowback water in an accidental scenario is minimized. And finally, we need to really develop a network, both pre-drilling and post-drilling network, that will provide information on water quality and its impacts on the local biota before we drill, and then continue to monitor after we drill. I think those are necessary for us to assess the environmental effects of any drilling activity.
Thanks, Newt. And the third report author who's with us here today is Kim Wolski. And Kim, could you offer a couple of points on the public perceptions?
Sure. So our report had sort of three objectives. We wanted to capture public sentiment about hydraulic fracturing in Michigan, but we also wanted to see what lessons could be learned from states where there's higher fracking activity. And then we also wanted to look at sort of the challenges of what makes this such a highly contentious issue. We know from a statewide poll that was conducted last year that while opinion about fracking covers an entire spectrum of people who support it to people who want to see an outright ban, overall there's a large majority of Michiganians who believe natural gas drilling in the state could be important to our state economy, but at the same time there are a lot of reservations about the risks, particularly with regard to the possibility of water contamination or negative health impacts. And we also see that there's overwhelming support for increased regulation, particularly mandatory disclosure of the chemicals that are used in fracking fluids. And I think an interesting finding that highlights sort of the reservations, even though a slight majority of Michiganians believe the benefits of fracking could outweigh the risks, we also see that 52% of Michiganians would support a moratorium until we more fully understand the risks. The other lessons we learned in this report from other states, other risks start to come to surface when fracking activity increases, so people become more concerned about sort of the social impacts, what happens when fracking rigs are set up and the changes to the community, the changes in aesthetics, or just in general a feeling that their sense of place has been altered. And then finally, the report also looks at sort of the challenges and opportunities for having a more productive dialogue. And as the summary that's on your screen suggests, one of the challenges is that sort of the technical experts and the public, we use fracking, that word, to mean different things. And that can cause problems in terms of when we talk about the risks of fracking. To the public, fracking is usually the entire process, and whereas for an oil and gas industry expert, fracking is a very specific process, and that can cause problems for public dialogue.
Okay, thanks, Kim. So we'd like to shift now to, well, here, just very quickly, I think if you've joined us for the webinar, you've probably seen these already, but here is the location where the reports can be downloaded from. Just click on the button that says View and Download. Also on that same page is where we are accepting public comments. What we're looking for are comments that will help guide the focus of the integrated assessment, the specific policy options that we might want to review and analyze kind of moving forward. We'll be accepting those through October 7th. But there's also another space on the project webpage where you can send us a comment at any time throughout the process. So we'd like to open it up now. Maggie has been following comments throughout the start of the presentation, and she's going to kind of share questions with us that we've either heard from several folks or questions that identify a particularly interesting point that we should consider.
First, I just want to let everybody know, since I received a few questions about it, that we will be posting this webinar to be viewed later, and it'll be available on the Graham Institute's website. So you will be able to see this presentation after today. There was an interesting question about the process. Someone wanted to know if any of the researchers visited any of the high-volume hydraulic fracturing well sites or how they've engaged with local community members.
Okay, I can start that. So last fall, a group of us, not everybody involved in the reports, did visit a site in northern Michigan. It was not a high-volume site. Given the limited amount of activity, it was pretty hard to get schedules and agreements together for that. But we were able to visit a site that was being fractured in northern Michigan, one of the shallower wells. And I believe one of the other faculty authors, Brian Ellis, is working on, now it's part of what is not included in the technical reports, but is working with one of the companies to collect a sample of flowback water to do some analysis on that. But I don't know if anybody else has visited any of the specifically the high volume sites.
No, I've visited gas well sites that have been in existence. Mm-hmm. This is Newton Analoff speaking, but have not visited the high volume sites. There are very few of them,
right.
Actually.
Very few.
And most of them are exploratory as far as my knowledge is.
Thank you. Next question.
Great. Sarah, this is probably a good question for you. Someone was concerned about exemptions in the Energy Policy Act that exempt sort of oil and gas from the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Clean Air Act. And so they're wondering if you could talk about that, about how your report addresses that.
Great. Yeah, so the report does cover the laws, the state laws, as well as the federal laws. And I do talk about some of the exemptions at the federal level. Probably the best known is an exemption under the Safe Drinking Water Act for the actual process of injecting fluids for hydraulic fracturing. That process is exempted from regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It has historically been regulated by the states, but the EPA has the one exception then to that exception is diesel in the fluids, and the EPA has released draft guidance, which is a form of policy, to explain how it would regulate hydraulic fracturing that includes diesel fluids. So that's I think in the works in terms of that particular one. There are certainly other exemptions, but I think I'll leave it there.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember in your report that diesel is currently not listed for any of the completions in Michigan. Or did I?
There have been. Yeah, I'll have to
okay,
back up
sorry.
John.
I jumped in. I thought.
All right, no, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we come back to that then?
There was an earlier question talking about natural gas prices, and they asked whether or not if natural gas prices are likely to increase as export facilities are brought online. Did the technology report take that into account when thinking about prices and hydraulic fracturing in Michigan?
So this is John. I don't think the technology report or the economics report specifically addresses that. I know export has been a big part of the conversation, particularly as we look at this topic from a national perspective. I'm not quite certain, since our focus is on Michigan, the reports really have not addressed that in any specificity. I don't know if any of the other report authors want to mention anything about export and impacts that might have on gas prices. No. Okay, and I think we can go back to my question about diesel to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, John. So according to a 2011 report done by the Democratic staff of a committee, a congressional committee, the service companies reported using diesel fuels in hydraulic fracturing fluid in wells in Michigan during the period of 2005 to 2009. From what I know, there have been no Safe Drinking Water Act permits given to operators historically, and I think part of the problem here really has been that the law isn't clear. There was this exception to the exception in the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it wasn't exactly clear whether service companies were actually using diesel fuels, and if they were using diesel fuels, there really wasn't necessarily a process that could be followed to obtain a permit, or at least that was the concern of the industry. So that's where we are on diesel fuels. It's an interesting issue.
Thank you. Next question.
Sarah, I'm going to sort of follow up with another question that probably makes sense for you to answer. Someone was talking about oil and gas lease contracts and how that's sort of one place where environmental protections can be brought in and can begin. And they give, for an example, that the American Petroleum Institute has best practices for protecting groundwater, including baseline testing, but they're not offered, but these are not offered to private mineral owners in a standard oil and gas lease. So the commenter noted that you talked about lease contracts in your report and wondered if you could sort of bring that up or highlight some of what you discussed.
I think this is one of the really interesting issues related to high-volume hydraulic fracturing is what can private landowners, through negotiations with oil and gas companies, how do they work out environmental protections? And I think it's an open question, and there has not been. MSU has done a lot of work on leases in Michigan, and I know they're doing some surveys on what people have used in leases. I think it would be great to do some more empirical research on what are the specific provisions in leases. But at least anecdotally, we know that some some landowners are in fact negotiating testing requirements, requirements to handle surface damage, these types of things in leases. And I think another interesting point to make is the difference between the the private leases and the state lease. I think in the state lease you see a lot more environmental protections, which is really related to the fact that the state, of course, has a monopoly on a huge amount of mineral ownership, and so can set the terms, I think, more for environmental issues.
Thanks, Sarah. We're past 12:30. I think we'll take one more question and kind of go through that. Maggie?
Yeah, just to remind everybody, I do have copies of all of your questions and comments, so if we weren't able to get to them, don't worry. We will be passing all of your input on to the folks that will be putting together the integrated assessments. So these comments from the webinar, as well as the formally submitted comments to the website, will all make it to the team working on the integrated assessment. But one last question to bring up today is someone asked, to what extent is climate change addressed in the reports, in particular methane emissions, and how does that play into the technical reports and the integrated assessment?
Thanks, Maggie. So the impact on climate change as a result of hydraulic fracturing is an important topic and of interest to many. There's substantial ongoing discussion about the benefits of cleaner burning natural gas and concerns about increased methane emissions. Within the technical reports, though, this topic is not considered in depth. However, the public health report, particularly on page 17, does provide an overview of greenhouse gases and hydraulic fracturing. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at that section. This is another one of the topics like the potentially the impact on prices from export. That's a bit of a challenge for us to really focus in on, given that our focus is on this activity in the state of Michigan, and some of these broader conversations need more of a national or an international perspective to consider them in their entirety. We're thinking that for the integrated assessment report, the final report that will come out of this project mid-2014, in addition to the specific analysis of policy options for the state of Michigan, we will include some overview and general information on some of these broader topics, such as climate change, impact on renewables, offer what, because these topics are being looked at by other folks, and offer some of the best information we can pull together on these topics in that final report, even though it will not be addressed specifically, probably, in terms of the analysis of options we offer for Michigan. Would any of the report co-authors like to make a final comment or note before we conclude the webinar? No?
I could make one.
Okay.
When we consider environmental impacts, one thing that wasn't in the report but that's important to consider is as gas leases are purchased from private landowners, there is a risk of people foregoing conservation easements. There was an earlier question about whether we have been in discussion with people across the region about this, and as director of the biological station, which is in the northern third of lower Michigan, I've attended a lot of public meetings and talked with people in conservancies and so forth, and there is a lot of concern about people being less willing to grant conservation easements because of the potential value of their land for gas leasing. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that could impact the environmental component of our.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Maggie, any final comments to the folks joining us in the webinar? I think you've said it already in terms of we will post this, the presentation, the recording. We'll work with the questions and put all of that together. And we hope to have this posted as soon as possible, perhaps as early as tomorrow. But all that information will be there. And I've just left up a general email address if there are any questions, comments, concerns, something isn't working for you in terms of downloading the report or submitting your comments. This email goes directly to Maggie and me, and we are watching this quite carefully to respond to folks to make sure things are working, and that if you have comments and are trying to submit them, that everything is working for you. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to receiving comments over the next month to help guide the integrated assessment, and we will be back in touch with, at this point we have over, I think, 600 folks in our contacts database to be in touch with as we move forward with the project. There will be additional opportunities for input and review of draft reports moving into the next year, and we appreciate and thank you in advance for any comments or information that you send our way for this project. Thank you. And we're going to end the webinar now.